We're looking at John chapter 21, finishing up the Gospel of John this morning. We started this chapter last week, and we started the story last week. We told half of the story, talked about how Jesus had appeared to his disciples for the third time following his resurrection. And we talked about how John sets the scene for this story. He sets the scene, and I can imagine John many, many years after all of this has taken place. And the way that he tells this story, in my mind's eye, reflects his experience over the decades following Jesus' resurrection in the formation of this new church. He's looking back and he's telling this story, and it's almost bittersweet. You can almost taste it as you read his words about what happened on that morning, about how Jesus appeared to them on the shore, about how he called them once again to follow him, about how he reminded them of the day that they were fishing years back, and he called them to leave their nets and follow after a great catch of fish, about the bread and the fish that he already had there baking when they got out of the boat, about how he invited them to add their catch to what he already had cooking, about they ate breakfast together, watching him break the bread and break the fish into pieces and to give it to them. We're finishing this story, and we're picking up in verse 15 of John chapter 21. John tells us, "When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, 'Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these?' 'Yes, Lord,' he said, 'you know that I love you.' Jesus said, 'Feed my lambs.' Again, Jesus said, 'Simon, son of John, do you truly love me?' And he answered, 'Yes, Lord, you know that I love you.' Jesus said, 'Take care of my sheep.' The third time he said to him, 'Simon, son of John, do you love me?' Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, 'Do you love me?' He said, 'Lord, you know all things, and you know that I love you.' Jesus said, 'Feed my sheep. I tell you the truth. When you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go.' Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. And then he said to him, 'Follow me.' Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. This was the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper and had said, 'Lord, who is going to betray you?' When Peter saw him, he asked, 'Lord, what about him?' And Jesus answered, 'If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me.' Because of this, the rumor spread among the brothers that this disciple would not die. But Jesus did not say he would not die. He only said, 'If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you?' This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know his testimony is true. Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written." John tells us this story that in my Bible is under a heading, Jesus reinstates Peter. When I think the whole story, the story of Jesus appearing on the side of the lake, calling out to them, the catch of fish, handing them the bread and the fish at the breakfast, all of it is a beckoning once again to every one of his disciples, every one of these men who had followed him and witnessed his teaching and witnessed his healing and witnessed his miracles, witnessed his death, and now his resurrection. A calling to those men once again to be his disciples, to follow him. This isn't just a reinstatement of Peter. We talked about how Thomas gets a bad rap. We call him Doubting Thomas, right? Well, in some ways, Peter gets a bad rap too. Yes, did Peter deny Christ? Yes, he did. But where was everybody else? Where was everyone else? They were hiding in their hidey holes. They didn't even come to see what would happen to Jesus. They had run away. Peter followed. Peter followed at a distance to see what would happen. And yes, he was caught off guard in that courtyard. And yes, he said, "No, I don't know him," out of self-preservation. But he was there. He was there. So when it says in my Bible, Jesus reinstates Peter, I really want to scratch that out and say, Jesus reinstates them all. Jesus reinstates them all. Jesus calls them all again to follow him. Jesus calls them all again, reminds them all again where they were when he found them, fishing. Calls them once again to follow. Tells them it's not over yet. We've talked about how they had no idea what was coming next. They didn't know what to do. Nobody had written a church planting manual yet. No one had written evangelism strategies yet. No one had any clue what would come next. Jesus says to them, "Follow me." That's what's next. They didn't know from the moment they left their nets the first time what would happen next. We all want a blueprint. I want a blueprint. God, it'd be nice if you just give me the highlights. I don't even have to know day by day, just like, where are we going next, God? But everything that we do in life, everything is an act of faith, because who knows what's coming next? When you walk out the door in the morning, it's an act of faith, because who knows what's coming next? When we grow up, when we leave home, when we pack our room and we head out, it's an act of faith, because who knows what's happening next? If we get married, if we choose a career, if we have children, it's an act of faith, because who knows what's going to happen next? Everything we do in our lives, everything we do is an adventure, because none of it comes with a guarantee. It's interesting how eager we are to walk out the door in the morning, and how hesitant we are to say yes when God calls us. It's interesting that we want more of a guarantee from God than what we will expect from other things in our lives. When you get up and go to work in the morning, you have no idea if your job will be there at the end of the day. You think it will be, you hope it will be, kind of depending on it to be, but you don't know. When you get in your car and you put your key in the ignition, there's no guarantee that it's going to start. You hope it will. It has in the past. It did yesterday. You haven't had any problems. But you have no idea what's happening next, what's coming next. No idea. And so Jesus calls them once again, saying, you didn't know what was going to happen the first time. This is nothing new. This is nothing new. Follow me. Jesus reinstates them all. Now, he does have a special conversation with Peter, because Peter needs this. Peter desperately needs this. Jesus said to him at that Last Supper, "You will deny me." And Peter said, "Oh, I will not." Jesus said, "Before the cock crows, you will deny me." And what happens? He denies him. The same Peter who said, "I will go and die with you." The same Peter who was always impetuous, always jumping in with both feet, who thought himself to be strong and brave, courageous, comes face to face with his own mortality and he shrinks back. He denies Jesus, and he needs to have this conversation with Jesus because Peter is important. Peter is important in the formation of the early church. Peter didn't know that yet when this conversation took place. John didn't know that yet when this conversation took place. Only Jesus knew how important it was for Peter to be specifically commissioned in this conversation. Feed my sheep, Peter. Shepherd my flock, Peter. Feed my sheep. Follow me. Peter needed to hear those words. And I think it's interesting that John, while John is the disciple that Jesus loved, John was not the one to lead the early church. And when John wrote this down, John knew all of the things that had transpired. He knew. This is something John wrote at the end of his life. His is the final testimony from those who lived and walked with Jesus. When he wrote this story, or when he dictated it, he knew all of the things that would come. He was looking back. He was looking back, and he recognized how important this conversation was. He recognized how important it was for Jesus to ask Simon, son of John, "Do you truly love me more than these?" Now, I wish John had been a little more specific, because it's kind of hard to know what that question means. And I have looked, and I have tried, and there are lots of theories. There are lots of speculations about what Jesus is asking when he says, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these?" Is he asking him, "Simon, is your love for me greater than the other disciples' love for me?" Okay, that's a possibility. Is he asking, "Simon, son of John, do you really love me more than you love your fellow disciples?" Right, the guys sitting around the fire. He could have also been saying, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these fish that you just pulled out of this sea? Do you truly love me more than these?" I don't know what he's asking. But guess who did? Peter knew what he was asking. Peter knew what he was asking. Peter knew specifically because Peter didn't have to ask for clarification. Peter says, "Yes, Lord. Of course. Without hesitation. You know that I love you. Forget the past. Forget those times when I messed up. Forget those times when I stepped out of line. You know that time when you said, 'Get thee behind me, Satan'? Yeah, forget that one too, please. You know that I love you. You know that I love you." And Jesus said to him, "Feed my little lambs." That word that's translated lambs really does mean teeny tiny sheep. Feed my little lambs. Feed my vulnerable lambs. Look around you and see that you're surrounded by people who need your love and care. Now, this is a specific challenge to Peter because who's Peter? He's the one who puts on his outer garment before he jumps in the water. He's the one who says, "Hey, Jesus, if that's really you, tell me to come out on the water. I'll walk to you." This is Peter who runs up to Jesus during the transfiguration, one of the most holy moments yet on the face of the earth. Hey, Jesus, you want me to build some tents? There's some nice trees over here. I can build some lean-tos. Peter's always impulsive. Peter's a man of action, but he's not the one who sits around and looks at the people and says, these are vulnerable people who need protection and shelter and care. Peter's ready to jump in with both feet, but Peter needs to stop. If Peter is going to lead the early church, if he's going to lead God's people, he needs to stop and look and see them, to see their needs, to see their hearts, to see that they are precious, tiny, vulnerable little lambs. And Jesus asks him again, Simon, son of John, do you truly love me? And he answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And Jesus said, shepherd my sheep. A shepherd is one who goes first. You with cattle and with other animals, you can herd them from behind and from the sides. With sheep, you have to lead them. You have to go first. They follow your feet and the sound of your voice. You have to go first. Shepherd my sheep, Peter. Now we're beyond the realm of fishing metaphors. Peter was a fisherman. What do you do with fish? You get them in a net and you bring them in. Done. Fix the net, do it again tomorrow. Jesus is talking a whole new language, a whole new way of functioning. Shepherd my sheep. The third time he says to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter was hurt. I love that John leaves that in there. John, looking back at this story, and he says, oh, Peter was just crushed. He was just absolutely devastated that Jesus would ask him not once, not twice, but 3 times, do you love me? Do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him on that third time, do you love me? And he said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. And Jesus said, feed my sheep. Take care of my little lambs. Shepherd my sheep. Keep the flock together. Feed my sheep. And then Jesus tells him this hard thing. Jesus gets his commitment first. Do you really love me? Because things are coming down the pike where you're going to have to decide. You might as well decide today, do you love me? I tell you the truth, when you were younger, you did whatever you wanted to do. You put on the clothes you wanted, you went out and did the things you wanted, you went out and fished with your father, you left that, you followed me, you went out fishing this morning. But a time is coming when you're old. You'll stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you. Someone else will lead you to where you don't want to go. Following Jesus would come with a price, and no one knew that better than John, who was telling this story. When John wrote this, he knew that Peter would die. When he wrote this, he knew that after this, Peter's death would be a martyrdom. He knew that it would be a witness, that it would glorify God. John knew these things. And so looking back, he says to us, he gives us a clue. He said, Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. John didn't know it when he heard those words. Peter didn't know it when he heard those words. Isn't that just kind of a universally true statement that when you're young, you get to do whatever you want? When you get old, people are going to make you do things you don't want to do? Kind of the truth. It's kind of the truth. As long as you're mobile and able to care for yourself, you've got the run of the whole world. When you become dependent on someone else to take care of you, you start to lose your choices. You start to lose your independence. Who knows what they thought when they heard that statement on that morning? But looking back, John knew that Jesus was telling Peter, this is a hard road that you're going to walk for me. But do it anyways. Follow me. He said to him, follow me. And where did Jesus go? To a cross. Jesus said to Peter, follow me, but where did Jesus go? To laying down his life. To self-sacrifice. Not self-glorification. Not making a name for himself. Not building a little earthly movement, but laying everything down. Follow me. Peter turned, and like Peter, this is a very Peter thing to do. Peter turns and he sees John's following them, listening in on their conversation. It's a good thing he did. We wouldn't know what he said. He turns and he sees John following them, and he goes, hey, what about him? What about him? This is a serious talk we're having here, Jesus. I don't know exactly what you're talking about, but it sounds pretty ominous. What about him? If he loves you so much. You just asked me if I loved you. What about this guy? The disciple Jesus loves. You going to ask him if he loves you? You going to ask him? And Jesus says what Jesus says to all of us when all of us ask that question. Because we do, don't we? We do. We hit a hard thing in our lives and we say what? Why me? Why me? It's basically what Peter is asking here. Wait. This guy loves you too. What about him? Why me? Why me, Jesus? And Jesus says to him, what is that to you? You follow me. You're not called to the same things as him. He's not called to the same things as you. Your lives are going to look different. What is that to you? You follow me. He says this, he makes this statement, and remember, this is John who's writing this down. He makes this statement to Peter, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? Now that statement becomes ever so much more heavy with meaning when you know that at the end of his life, John was the only one left. He watched as one after another of his 11 closest friends went to their deaths. It happens to all of us in time, doesn't it? In time, we lose the ones we love, but John saw them die at the hands of cruel oppressors. John writes this statement, what if I want him to remain alive until I return? John's alive, everybody else is dead. And it makes me wonder if John isn't reflecting on this statement going, how much more? How many more years? How much longer? I don't know which is harder. The task given to Peter to lead the early church, his death as a martyr, or being John, the one who survived it all. An old man looking back. And Jesus hasn't come back yet. He gives us some more inside information here. He says, look, because he said this and everybody was saying, oh, John's going to live forever. John's not going to die. But John is an old man. And John knows that his knees hurt. John knows that it's hard for him to get up and down. John knows that his stomach hurts. John knows his eyesight is failing. John knows that his body is deteriorating and that he's old. And he says, but Jesus didn't say that he would not die. He only said, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? John is the one who testified to these things. He's the one who wrote them down. He's the one who's telling this story. And this is how he ends it. Not with an ascension to glory, but with breakfast by the lake and a call to follow Jesus. Which I think is so interesting. It's so telling that John leaves us hanging. He leaves us wanting more. He leaves us uncertain, like the disciples were on that morning, uncertain about the future, uncertain about what would come next, uncertain, not sure, but stepping out in faith. Stepping out in faith to follow. John says, Jesus did so many other things that if every one of them were written down, not even the whole world would have room for the books that would be written. Eugene Peterson says it like this, and the library, he says it like this, there's so many things that Jesus did. I can't imagine a world big enough to hold such a library of books. It's like the hymn that we sing, and it says, if the sky was made of parchment, Charlotte's favorite song. Sky was made of parchment. If the oceans, if every body of water was ink, we'd drain the oceans dry. We'd fill up the whole sky with God's goodness. The world isn't big enough to hold the library of books if we were to write it down. And that was John's testimony at the end of his something about 90 years of life. That's his final word. We couldn't write it all down. There's too much. And now, 2,000 years later, 1,900 years later, the stories are still being written. Because God is still at work. Jesus is still at work. At work in you and at work in me. At work in places in the world we've never heard of and we will never visit, and yet God is at work there. Jesus is still calling out, follow me. He's still calling out, do you love me? Follow me. The path isn't certain. The future on this earth is not sure. But follow me anyways. You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, whether you follow me or not. So follow me. You and I don't know what's going to happen in the future. Why not say yes to whatever it is that God is asking you to do? And I believe he's asking. I believe he's calling. And if you don't hear it, sit quiet and listen. Because if you have breath in your lungs, there is a reason for you to be walking around on the earth. It's not the same as anybody else's calling. But God is calling. Jesus is calling to you. Follow me. And why not? Why not say yes? I hope you will.